Was Thomas Hobbes woke? So, this is a slightly ridiculous title, but I thought it would work well because there's something about Thomas Hobbes, the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, which does resonate with our current era of what we've called wokeness. No one's really defined wokeness well. There's been debates over whether it's a form of Marxism or neo-Marxism or whether it's a form of liberalism. I suppose because I'm making this video, and Hobbes is in many ways known as the first liberal, I tend to fit into the category that presumes that wokeness is a form of liberalism or hyper-liberalism, as the philosopher John Gray calls it. But there's a lot of kind of historical accusations which get thrown around with wokeness. Does it emerge from postmodernism? Did Foucault create wokeism? Did Marx create wokeism somehow? Is it a form of liberalism? Is it an expression of liberal thought, and so on and so forth, kind of progressive liberal thought? So we tend to have a kind of jury about it the whole time. We claim it's like a game of Cluedo or something. It's like, who killed Western society with the weapon that is wokeness? Was it Marx? I saw him in the dining room with a hammer at 5 o'clock. No, it wasn't. It was Foucault. I saw him in the lounge with a knife at 7 o'clock. We basically play Cluedo with wokeness because it seems like Western society is is in a deep state of decline, and we're always looking for someone to blame, and wokeness seems like almost like kind of like a weapon that's broken it, almost like the ring in Lord of the Rings. If only we'd thrown it into the fire of Mordor, it wouldn't have destroyed the world as we know it. So here's a kind of off the cuff attempt to accuse Thomas Hobbes of being the murderer of Western civilization, even though I quite like Hobbes in many ways. So I feel slightly ambiguous about this video, but there we go. So I want to try to define wokeism of having one key characteristic, which isn't exclusive to the people or the ideologies or the historical moment which wokeness kind of attached itself to. I would say wokeness is somewhat the result of the incapacity to have any sort of disagreement about the most important or primary or seemingly obvious things about life, reality, that we may be concerned about. It's not necessarily wokeness, but sort of whatever the kind of disposition of wokeness is, manifested through modern bureaucratic institutions, particularly through the kind of expert-driven institutions. They've managed to accomplish something incredible, which is to shut down the capacity for like well-educated people to say that there's a difference between a man and a woman. It's quite an accomplishment, actually. I actually really admire wokeness for this reason, because it's done something which I think like the most sort of power-hungry tyrant or the most zealous cult leader couldn't do, which is to like shut down an entire civilization full of like well-educated, scientifically educated people, and like force them to repeat like the most insane falsities. I don't mean to pick on the trans thing because it's just the most obvious example. There's plenty more examples of this, and I think that the recent events with the pandemic, for example, scared a lot of people because it showed you how much people are willing to just believe the most stupid crap, the most blatantly, obviously false crap, and we don't really know why they're willing to believe these things. And these aren't like uneducated medieval peasants who are being fooled by the clerical church or something. These are all well-educated people. The shocking thing about our time is how someone can have like a PhD and like work a white-collar job in a big institution and still be completely deranged. Like, I think that's really shocking to people. It is to me anyway, and I think that's one of the things which is motivating a sort of larger conversation around wokeness and around kind of Western decline and these issues, which really don't have a whole lot to do with like wokeness particularly, but rather a sort of almost psychotic break with reality that Western civilizations are currently undergoing. So to return to this historical courtroom and put Thomas Hobbes up in the testimonial box for questioning, we should understand that Thomas Hobbes lived through the British Civil War, and as a response to that, he created this contractual revolution, basically, in political and social moral thought, which is based around unity of a society being determined by a sort of contractual obligation to agree with the sovereign. We should understand that, like, from the very beginning, actually, Thomas Hobbes was not particularly concerned about this particular law or that particular law. He was concerned about almost kind of epistemic and moral and philosophical agreement. He was really worried that he understood quite rightly that if two men spend years arguing over what justice is or what truth is, they will never come to a rational verbal definition of this. They will never say, we've figured it out. Just like, you might figure out the best way to, I don't know, clean your dishwasher or something. There's no sort of obvious conclusive end to a rational verbal discussion over what is justice or what is truth. So Hobbes implied that this means that ultimately, if you have this disagreement between like truth, disagreement over the meaning of truth, justice, maybe God's will, what does God really want from us, and so forth. These kind of primordial and most important questions, things which relate to first principles. If you have disagreement over this will necessarily lead to violence, like widespread violent conflict, which will like tear a society apart and draw us into the state of nature. This was also largely because he lived through a time where there was contesting authority. So you had the crown, which was, obviously the monarch, but you also had an increasing schism between the church, I think, and the crown, and also the capacity for more people to read the Bible, which Hobbes complained about a lot, that everyone can read the Bible now, so we can all have our own interpretation of the Bible, and therefore we're all going to have our own interpretation of the Bible, so therefore we're all going to have like our own interpretation of like what justice or what God is and so forth, which is going to lead us into this state of chaos. So the only way out of this state of chaos is to basically agree to agree with the sovereign. It's not that you really agree, but that you agree to agree with the sovereign, if that makes sense. There's two forms of agreement. That sounds great to me. I think that's amazing. That sounds like it's true. I like that. That's agreement, right? I don't really believe it. I'm not sure. But apparently we have to agree on it, so I'm going to agree, if you get me. It's this agreeing to agree which has remanifested itself in our time. Do the bulk of liberal middle class people really think that there's no such thing as a boy or a girl? No, but they agree to believe it because that's the consensus. So you could say, well, once the consensus is agreed upon, eventually you do really believe it, because at first you agree to believe it and then eventually you just believe it. I think that's true, actually. I think that like real belief comes perhaps after you agree to believe something that you know is not actually true. We could call this epistemic conditioning or something like that, right? Is the consensus and agreement sort of turn something that you know isn't true into something true once you agree to act like it's true, and then once enough time has gone by, you're sort of epistemically conditioned into thinking it's true. This sort of answers the whole question of, is ideology a sort of Machiavellian tool for control and power, or is it something, that people really, really in the heart of in their heart of hearts believe? And I think that something can begin as merely acceptance of a power structure, and then it can eventually turn into real belief. I think that's, again, is what we could call epistemic conditioning. The peculiar thing about our time is that we are seemingly undergoing really intense levels of epistemic conditioning. So you have to believe that you have to agree to believe something that you know is not true is true. There's this constant moral authority which is being imposed on us, which I think is creating a lot of the kind of backlash and tension. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to work. I think it's already failing. But there has been, I think, probably, I don't know, for how long, maybe 20 years, 10 years, I don't know, a very harsh level of epistemic conditioning on us to believe things that we know are not true, or to agree to believe things we know are not true. And we don't really know why we're being told that we should agree to this, and is it possible to agree to it but not really believe it, and so on and so forth. I think that people are somewhat nostalgic about, like the 90s or the 80s, because this level of epistemic conditioning wasn't around back then. It emerged sometime in the 21st century. So I'm going to make the claim that this epistemic conditioning has something to do with the state of emergency. So the state of emergency is basically an acknowledgement that we don't have absolute perfect knowledge of what we should do, or what the best option in any situation is. We may not even be aware of what the options are. There are options which are responses to events which we don't even know exist, at the time of the event. So there's this epistemic limitation, which again is something Hobbes quite rightly observed. Epistemic limitation to human thought, which means that politics in many ways is sort of a makeshift capacity to act even without having perfect knowledge. That politics means we agree on something, we don't really know if it's the best decision or if it's perfectly true, and so on, but we have to act, and we have to create an order, and we have to create a kind of coherent, unified order in which we can live by. And I think that this is true. This is ultimately true, that we are, as humans, we don't have omnipotent godlike knowledge, and we are basically acting and making decisions with that epistemic limitation. And that's just a part of human political life. I think that's a good observation from Hobbes. That's not something we should scoff at. Some people might think, oh yes, science and AI will solve all the problems for us. I don't think that's true at all. I think we're always going to live with imperfect knowledge, and always have to make decisions with imperfect knowledge. Having said that, there seems to be what you might call a kind of temporal manipulation of this sense of urgency to have agreement in order to make decisions about things. So take a kind of a contemporary example of this. If you go into one of the things wokeness was known for example, was if you disagree with me, that's basically violence, or if you disagree with me, or if you offend me, or if you break one of these, little linguistic taboos, you're basically justifying or even somehow causing real violence. So there's this sort of insane, and it is insane, this insane inference of, a discussion or a kind of discourse or a kind of cognitive activity leads in some immediate sense to real almost cosmic physical harm. And I think this is the thing about wokeness, which really jars with people, and why I think that maybe it's gonna be like maybe not put away, but like this level of intensity may be lowered to some extent in the next few years. I'm not sure. That's another discussion. But the point being that wokeness is not exactly wrong. It's a controversial thing to say in the circles that I exist in, but it's not exactly wrong to sort of insist that rational discussion will not get us to where we want to necessarily be, and that things do have to be decided upon and acted upon. The problem with wokeness is basically that it manipulates this kind of political reality and says, and completely shuts down, any sort of debate or any sort of discourse or any sort of disagreement, even when there's no apparent need or necessity for agreement, if you understand what I'm saying. Like, if you go into a university classroom in a Western city where everyone's completely protected, there's no barbarians at the door, there's no immediate catastrophe at hand, and you say to people who could just walk out of the classroom after the class and just go home and nothing will happen to them, you disagree with me, therefore violence. Like, these people don't have a sense of reality, insofar as they don't have a sense of an appropriate necessity for agreement and an inappropriate necessity for agreement. Like, where situations where it's okay to not have agreement, and situations where you actually do need agreement. So, for example, Hobbes lived through the British Civil War. It was probably somewhat evident to him that more agreement is probably a good thing and a necessary thing. Whereas if you're like, some kind of hysteric, living in the modern world where you've never lived through a civil war, or you've never sort of you don't live inside like immediate conditions of catastrophe, it's not really appropriate for you to wield this level of like intense necessity for agreement. So what you have is this demand for consensus when there's actually no obvious need for consensus. It's basically what wokeness is, right? But we should also observe the role that experts, so-called experts, play here. Because if Hobbes is correct and politics is the makeshift order which sort of facilitates making decisions even though we have imperfect knowledge, what's happened over time is that experts have become a part of that order. And so political decision makers, whether that be a military general, a politician, I think in general just even parents on a less widespread scale, on a kind of micro scale, parents, teachers, anyone who has a sense of authority over any social group whatsoever has undergone in the past, probably since the end of World War II, this grotesque outsourcing of all decision makings to experts. And I think this is largely because politics is a sort of makeshift structure. Maybe it's a kind of technique, a sort of techne, in which facilitates the capacity for decision making without perfect knowledge. And I think that what's happened over time is that the standard of people that are in political and civic and social positions of authority and leadership have gotten so bad at decision making, and they've gotten so unwilling to make decisions because they're terrified of the responsibility of making decisions and so forth, that they've outsourced these decisions to these so-called scientific experts who are kind of like priests of like makeshift epistemic perfection. Like, they'll figure it out. There won't be any more ambiguity. We won't have to make decisions without perfect knowledge because the scientists and the psychiatrists and the doctors have this perfect knowledge, and so forth and so forth. And then you have this this class of like super empowered experts who make absolutely terrible decisions. And the reason that experts make terrible decisions is because they don't make decisions as if they're making political and moral and ethical decisions. They make decisions as if they're making scientific decisions. So they don't act with responsibility because they don't acknowledge that they're taking a risk, that they don't that all human decision making is imperfect in some way, and that there's always a risk, and therefore we need to be somewhat careful about that risk. Scientists and experts go, oh, yeah, we've run the numbers and we know exactly what everything is and should be, so do this. They don't have that sense of responsibility that the classical politician or teacher or military general had. So what's happened, in my opinion, is that you've had a decline of the capacity for like social, political, moral decision makers to act with a sense of responsibility and have the courage to act and so on. And you've had this outsourcing of decision making to experts and this empowerment of experts who kind of offend the old Christian, original sin ethic, because if politics is acting, if humans are making a political order and we are sort of flawed in some primordial sense, we have a kind of original sin, we have a limitation of knowledge. Experts basically reject that and say, no, we can just figure everything out perfectly and it's going to be brilliant and it's going to be amazing, and just wait, it's going to be absolutely brilliant. And it never is, of course. But the point is that the more human beings cannot exist with the sort of sense of responsibility of making decisions with limited knowledge, the more urgent and terrified and kind of panic prone, hence the state of emergency, they're going to be when they are in positions where they constantly have to make decisions. And they're going to be looking constantly for a way out of having to think about the best decision to make or having to make the decision. So it's in this regard which wokeness makes sense, because what wokeness does is it kind of constantly enforces and conditions us into, epistemically conditions us into the immediate consensus of the expert classes, who flex their power not just because they have this great idea or they think they have perfect knowledge, but just for the sake of flexing their power quite often. I think that's, again, to use the example of the lockdowns, I think a lot of these rituals were just sort of worshiping the expert classes. Like we're going to almost deliberately make contradictory rules and like nonsensical rules because if you know they're nonsensical and you still do them, that's a kind of act of worship. It's an act of faith, actually. Total faith in people to do something which is obviously stupid is actually the highest expression of faith in this case, well, not God, but in this case, this class of experts. So the class of experts start to then create this sense of constant panic unless we have immediate agreement and consensus about things, no matter how ridiculous that is. It's going to lead to catastrophe, right? It's going to lead to violence. It's going to lead to civil war. It's going to lead to chaos. It's going to lead to genocide. It's going to lead to everything terrible. The history of modern political thought, insofar as it's originated with contractualism to a large extent, has been the incapacity to live with some kind of ambiguity or some sort of kind of a sense of responsibility over political decision making or over any sort of decision making. This incapacity to be, kind of political, moral beings leads to a kind of anxiety, which then calls upon the experts to just give us consensus in the most ridiculous sense possible, no matter what that is. So this is my sort of definition of wokeness, that it's at least a part of a larger problem of not understanding the kind of context of when agreement is necessary and when it's not necessary, and having a kind of like very kind of hysterical, panic prone, knee jerk demand for consensus, like just for the sake of consensus, without the capacity to either make decisions or to think about what decisions that we should make, and so on. If you compare, for example, Socrates to Hobbes, you see like Socrates basically also understanding that you're not going to come to a verbal agreement definition on like the nature of the good or something like that, just because you have a little conversation about it. But for Socrates, that lack of verbal definition didn't mean we should panic. It didn't mean that we should go into a state of panic and demand agreement for the sake of agreement. It meant that we had a kind of vague recollection of the good, and that we had to cultivate that carefully, and that we had to use rational discourse to sort of stir that memory, and through that sort of intuition, I think, perhaps through the the kind of harmony of intuition and rational discourse, we could at least go in the right direction to making good decisions, albeit without perfect knowledge. From Thomas Hobbes onwards, you have almost a sort of different psychological and moral reaction to the observable fact that human beings cannot necessarily verbally or rationally create a definition and therefore an agreement on what to do regarding justice or the good and truth and so on. So whilst the ancients could live in that ambiguity and in a sense thrive in it, the moderns panic and they say no, we have to have any agreement at all. And I think that perhaps in terms of consensus and agreement, I think that what really distinguishes the moderns from the ancients is this. This is what it ultimately comes down to. And here's my definition of wokeness, or at least what wokeness is, one of many symptoms of this larger underlying problem. The ancients said bad consensus is not necessarily better than no consensus, right? Bad consensus is not necessarily superior to no consensus. Perplexity, confusion, a lack of knowledge is not necessarily worse than just having agreement for the sake of agreement. Whereas the modern world says, no. Agreement of any kind, no matter how ridiculous and stupid it is better than being in this state of perplexity and confusion and disagreement, because otherwise there's going to be a big catastrophe and we're going to be in a state of nature and everyone's going to kill each other and so on and so forth. Modernity has a kind of hysterical response to this primordial lack of kind of flaw of human nature, if you put it in Christian terms. The distinction between modernity and the ancient world is not that of knowledge, which is what the scientists will tell you because they're gay. And I'm joking, but they are kind of gay. The real distinguishing characteristic between the modern world and the ancient world is one of perseverance and endurance. The old world could persevere and endure a lack of agreement and a lack of knowledge much better than we can. We makeshift agreements, no matter what they are, no matter how stupid they are, and we epistemically condition people into them just because we're unable to tolerate any time, any sort of duration of that perplexity and that epistemic imperfection and limitation and so on. That's the defining distinction. So in that sense, I think that Thomas Hobbes maybe he's not woke, but he began something, or at least he was the expression of something, which I think is the substance of wokeness. And I think that wokeness has done us a favor in a weird way, because it's allowed us to maybe create a genealogy of this problem, or understand this problem in more holistic terms, basically. So is Thomas Hobbes woke? Sort of.